I do, ma'am.
Thank you. You can always.
Could you please state your name for the record?
My name is Michael G. Haag, H-A-A-G.
And how are you employed?
I'm employed, self-employed with my company Forensic Science Consultants. I also work for a law enforcement agency and crime lab.
And what crime lab and law enforcement agency is that?
The Albuquerque Police Department Crime Lab in New Mexico.
And what is your job title?
Senior Forensic Scientist.
And how long have you worked with the Albuquerque Police Department?
About the same amount of time as I've worked with my own private company or had my own private company, coming up on 22 years now.
And can you tell the court about your formal educational background?
Your Honor, for purposes of this hearing, we'll stipulate that he's qualified in the general area of crime scene reconstruction. This is going to be more geared towards the 705, specifically for this case, what his opinions were and what that was based on.
So you stipulate that he is in fact an expert in crime scene reconstruction?
Yes, he has a formal education and expertise in that area, but again, we're just looking more specifically about what his opinions are and what he's going to testify in this particular case.
Judge, just for purposes of this hearing, I'm going to offer Defendant's Exhibit number 81, the CV of Mr. Haag.
No objection for this hearing, Your Honor.
You wish to put that in for record purposes and may I review it?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. It's admitted for record purposes or all purposes for this hearing.
Mr. Haag, what is shooting reconstruction?
Shooting incident reconstruction is the use of physical evidence logic to try and piece together, if you will, what may or may not have happened during a shooting incident.
And have you been asked to provide opinions and conduct shooting incident reconstructions on numerous occasions?
I have.
And have you testified in state court?
I have.
In what jurisdiction?
Primarily in New Mexico. However, in addition to New Mexico, I've testified in Rhode Island, California, Colorado, quite a few others that I probably can't remember off the top of my head. Washington, D.C. Yeah.
In this case, did I ask you to review the Leica scan data provided by Leica scans done by the Texas Rangers and also by the Dallas Police Department?
You did.
And do you actually teach members of both those agencies and how to conduct Leica scans and how to interpret them?
I'm reasonably certain that I've had Dallas Police Department crime scene folks in my shooting incident reconstruction courses. I know I've had quite a few of the Texas Rangers in my classes, yes.
And do you recall, have you had Ranger Adcock?
I believe so.
And for purposes of your analysis, which scan data did you use?
I looked towards the Ranger scan data for two reasons. It was registered and it had trajectory rod data that was very clear, and they also used imaging, which allows color to be put on top of the data points, which makes the representation easier to look at for people that aren't used to looking at point cloud data.
And the judge heard about the point cloud data yesterday, but were you able to rely on the data obtained by Ranger Adcock and make measurements based on that data?
I was.
Did you also review discovery, police reports, photos, body camera that were provided to you?
I did.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
want to show you defendant's exhibits 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, and 89, and ask you if those are copies of measurements that you made using the Leica scan data obtained by the Texas Rangers.
They are.
Judge, this time I offer defendant's exhibits 82 through 89. For purposes of the hearing. Okay. No objection for purposes of this hearing.
Very good, please, here.
Mr. Haag, can you explain to the court the process of how you use the data from the Leica scan of Ranger Adcock to perform your own measurements?
The scan data itself was pre-registered, as I indicated before, so it's several scans put together, and I used this single large scan to evaluate several hypotheses, several proposals as far as witness viewpoints or line of sight examination. So what you're looking at here is a direct top-down view of the scan data, and I simply use that data to place markers of interest or that could be used for demonstrative purposes.
And for record purposes, that's defendant's exhibit 88 that's shown on the screen. And what is the red dot?
The red dot is simply a little marker on the ground, so it has no significant height to it, at a distance of approximately 3 feet in from the threshold of the apartment itself.
And based on your review of the evidence and the review of the entire case, is that a point that would be possible for the barrel of gun to be positioned when this shooting occurred?
It is based on an approximation and an assumption. In no way do I assert that that is where the firearm was, but it is meant to be a marker, a reference point that could be used to cross-check hypotheticals.
And is that something that you do in shooting reconstructions to look at different points or possibilities and determine whether the evidence rules it in, rules it out, or it's a reasonable possibility?
It is, and in fact 3D laser scan data has been a major part in allowing for this type of an evaluation because it documents three-dimensional space so well compared to the tools that we would have used 15, 20 years ago.
And is there any evidence, physical evidence, anything about the case that you've seen that would rule out the possibility that the barrel of the gun was in that position where the red dot is?
I've seen nothing that would rule it out, but again, let me be clear, I'm not saying the firearm would have been right there over the red dot.
What is the blue dot?
You're looking actually down on a cylinder that is raised to a height I'll talk about in a minute, but it is another marker that is nominally on the path between the red dot and the impact site that is known in the wall off to the left of this diagram. And it's, I believe, as I recall, 13 feet nominally from the threshold of the door.
And what is the green dot?
Similarly, the green dot is along the same line, a post, as you'll see in a future view, but that is about 15 feet from the threshold of the door.
If we can go to the overhead view call-outs, which is Defendant's Exhibit 89. Bring that. And is that the with the labels that shows what each dock is?
It is. Those are my markings on top.
Let's go to the 3 feet inside door, 4 feet 6 inch AGL, which is Defendant's Exhibit 87. And what is that?
This is actually a view of the scan data over the red marker, which again is 3 feet inside the threshold of the door, but from a vantage point 4 feet 6 inches above the ground. And again, with these measurements, while the placement of the viewpoint is very accurate, it's not meant to indicate that this is what someone viewed. It is used for a demonstrative purpose to show what the three-dimensional space of this scene looks like from that vantage point.
And why 4 feet 6 inches?
As is common in shooting incident reconstruction, we may use models, we may use conclusions, logic, assumptions, truly in the scientific sense, to propose hypothesis or use it as a starting place for a discussion. So 4 feet 6 inches was used and chosen as an approximate height for a firearm if it were held by someone who's approximately 5'3" at the shoulder height. So I used a model basically to come up with that as an approximate height for demonstrative purposes.
And so this is actually at gun level view, correct?
That's correct. And in my mind, in shooting incident reconstruction, rarely do I try to duplicate or show what an eyewitness or a participant might show. It's, in my work, much more logical to work from the firearm. So correct, if we assume or take the hypothesis that the gun was 4'6", this is what the gun would see, if you will.
And is that the type of when you're doing shooting incident reconstruction, you're tracking the bullet projecting from the end of the barrel, and so is that important when you're trying to look at possible trajectories or shooting angles and that type of thing?
It is, particularly over short distances such as we're dealing with here, because projectiles travel, from common firearms, travel fast enough over these shorter distances that we assume a linear model. In other words, gravity doesn't have a significant effect over a short distance like 30 feet. And so if we put ourselves in a location where the bullet emerged from the muzzle, we can see what it potentially could then go and strike.
And did I ask you to make some measurements as indicated in the overhead view that we showed the judge earlier?
That's correct.
If we go to the green 4'3" post and the inside and impact view, that's Defendant's Exhibit number 85. And what is, again, is this just looking at the, or we'll tell the judge what we're looking at here?
I believe this to be the same image. None of the markers or demonstrative aids are in this image. It appears just to be a viewpoint or vantage point from that 3 feet inside the threshold location.
And we go to the inside green 4'3" portal 15 feet. And what is this?
Now we're seeing that marker. We can see that it has height, that it's a cylinder, but the vantage point from above the red marker 3 feet inside the apartment complex is the same. You're just looking at a spot in space, nominally between the red marker and the impact that will show up on the wall here in a second in the next image, what 4'3" above the ground looks like from the vantage point of the muzzle of the firearm, if it were at 4'6" above the ground.
And 4'3" is that, in shooting reconstruction, do you use a lot of different sources to try and show reasonable hypotheses?
We do, just as a medical examiner or myself could use a dummy with trajectory rods in it to demonstrate such things. We use similar people to try and measure heights above ground for, say, gunshot wounds.
And what did the 4 foot 3 inch, what did you use for that?
Again, similar to the 4'6" for a shoulder height, a person of nominal size to someone who was 6'1", with a marker about where an entry gunshot wound would have been based on the autopsy report, but bent over such that the upper body and torso was similar to, or in relation to the ground, making the trajectory through the body nominally horizontal. Again, all of these are approximations.
And the next photo, the impact in view and trajectory, Defendant's Exhibit 86. And what does that show?
In this image, we now see a yellow disc on the wall, which is where the impact site is in the back wall. And it's difficult to see because of the lack of perspective of the yellow line, but that's actually the trajectory established from the Ranger data coming back away from that impact site.
And is the green marker, the green rod, lined up approximately with the line from the Ranger's scan?
Again, yes, just nominally for reference. So an individual looking at this image could get a feeling for where it was. It's nominally underneath that yellow trajectory coming out of the impact site, yes.
And is that part of what you're doing in shooting reconstruction, showing spatial relations between evidence and known values and looking at variables in relation to that?
I think that's a fair statement. That's one component of shooting incident reconstruction.
And with regard to what you know about this case from reviewing the evidence and from seeing everything, is that a reasonable hypothesis of a possibility of where the complainant could have been standing when they were shot?
I certainly wouldn't rule that marker out as a possibility based on the physical parameters of the scene. In no way am I saying that is where the decedent in the gunshot wound would have been at the time the shot was fired. But because of that height, at least it gives a viewer an idea, if you want to say it was a little higher, a little lower, left or right, a marker to examine different hypotheses by, as opposed to saying that anything is possible, which anything is not possible.
The 4 foot 3 inch post at 13 feet. And that's Defendant's Exhibit 83. What are we looking at there?
Same concept, just with the post now blue at the 13-foot mark from the threshold as opposed to the 15. So by comparing the two, the 15 versus the 13, at the same height, both those posts are created in the data as 4 foot 3 inch above ground level. You can see a difference in height if you switch back and forth between them, but get an idea relative to the data about what 4 foot 3 inches looks like.
And Defendant's Exhibit number 83, the next slide. I'm sorry, yeah. That was 83. This is Defendant's Exhibit 82. Does that show in relationship with the impact?
It does. Same image basically, but now with the yellow marker on the wall.
And are you also a firearms instructor?
I have the certifications to be a firearms instructor, yes.
And in your experience, have you fired a weapon on thousands and thousands of occasions? Have you been in the shooting range with other law enforcement officers? Is it an integral part of your studies, the action of ballistics and firearms?
Yes, with several added components. Number one, of course, I'm not a law enforcement officer. My background is in science and chemistry. So while that being said, I actively participate with law enforcement officers. I shoot on a very regular basis a wide variety of firearms under a wide variety of circumstances.
And trained in these situations, or trained with shooting on the range, different with one hand or two hands, is that correct?
Actually, one component of my training includes law enforcement training in the use of firearms at a fundamental level, and I qualify every year with law enforcement officers, and one of the drills is indeed one-hand shooting.
Can you explain to the judge the action that normally occurs when firing with the arm extended from the shoulder with firing one-handed?
I can describe my personal experience in doing that drill is that the firearm tends to go up and to the right when I shoot it one-handed, right-handed.
And have you seen that consistently in your shooting reconstruction or in your looking at the at impacts and what other people have shot as well?
I would.
Based on your personal experience.
Yeah, I would say that falls away from a forensic conclusion. That is more my personal experience in shooting in that manner.
In this case, was it a consistent recollection of the ear witnesses that the shots were very quick in succession?
That is my understanding, is the audio witnesses indicate quick succession shots.
And is a double tap a common manner in which an officer fires a weapon in a deadly threat situation?
I would probably, well, my training is not to use that term double tap. The term that I was taught was standard defensive response, but it means two shots in quick succession.
And would you tell the court, based on the shots being quick together, how you would expect the trajectory angles to be related to each other?
The quicker two shots are together, the likelihood of them being relatively parallel to each other increases, as opposed to obviously having more time for movement to take place.
And with regard to the cartridge cases that were found in the kitchen, what forensic value did they have for you in this case?
What's commonly referred to as ejection pattern testing, or trying to determine a relationship between a firearm when it's discharged and where fired cartridge casings wind up, is a common practice in shooting incident reconstruction, but scenes and scenarios like this give the reconstructionists much caution because of the confined environment. So while they're recovered in that kitchen alcove area, the most I would opine to is that it just gives you the impression that the firearm was within the threshold of the door, more than likely, as opposed to, say, outside. We also, I know, from having reviewed the documentation, that there were accounts of cartridge casings actually being kicked or moved. So that adds to the caution that we should have in inferring significant amounts from their location.
I'll pass, please.
Mr. Haag, you said you used the Ranger scan to compile this, correct?
I did.
You would agree with me that the DPD scan was taken before the Ranger scan, correct?
That's my understanding.
Okay, and you would agree with me that the Ranger scan had several things in the apartment moved from the DPD scan, correct?
Obviously, I saw the moved ottoman for sure, but now I understand recently that the couch would have been moved, so I understand that.
Okay. So you now know that the scan you used, the couch and the ottoman were both moved, correct?
That's my understanding.
And you realize that the scene, even before DPD scanned it, was things were moved around, correct?
I don't know that that's what happened, but I certainly wouldn't rule it out considering the activity seen in, say, body camera video.
Let me ask you this. On the body camera, did you see that the ironing board was moved?
I wouldn't have said that that would have stuck out in my mind as an object that was moved, but I would not have refuted it either.
Well, here's the reason why I asked that is if we put up your slide presentation again, the spots where you have sort of put a possibility as to where the decedent was when he was shot are basically exactly where the ironing board was. Did you realize that?
No, I did not.
Okay. Would you agree with me?
Judge, I'm going to object. I don't think Mr. Fike can say that with any assertion that a spot was where the ironing board was.
Maybe I misunderstood, but that's not what I heard. What did you say again, Mr. Fine?
Basically, well, I guess I'll just ask the question again in a
I
different
believe
way.
your assertion was his spots were located in the place where the ironing board had been moved to.
Basically, what I was saying is his blue and green dot, Mr. Haag, where you had those. If you look at the body cam, if you look at the initial body cam, that's right in the area where the ironing board was before the officer moved it to where it is in your scan. But you did not realize that, correct?
Correct, and I would say that the location of the dots, well, I'd take two different directions with that. One, I wouldn't say that the ironing board, well, the video doesn't tell me that the ironing board was indeed right there prior to somebody moving it, but I would expand that on the other side to say that, again, the blue and the green dots aren't meant to represent exact locations where the gunshot wound would have been, simply a height distant from the threshold.
And that's kind of where I was going next, is basically you're putting these blue and green dots, you're using some kind of estimation just to plot points, correct?
I wouldn't phrase it as just to plot points, but I think the value is the spatial relationship of a particular height versus the location near the threshold.
Well, let's start with this. The 12 to 15 feet, where are you getting those numbers from? Or 13 to 15 feet, where are you getting those numbers from?
Those numbers come from discussions and the statements, as I recall, from Ms. Guyger as far as distances from the threshold. So they're representative of those distances.
Okay, when you say statements, are you talking about her testimony today in trial?
I recall hearing it today in trial, but as I recall, it was prior to trial as well, especially the 15-foot, as I recall.
Okay, so you're talking about the statement that she gave that is not in evidence, correct?
I would have to go back and try and find that exact statement, obviously, which I don't have in front of me. But I pulled that data or that information from materials that were provided to me in discovery.
All right, were you in court this morning for her testimony?
I was not.
Okay, did you know this morning her testimony, she actually said two different things in terms of where the complainant was when he was shot. Did you know that?
I did hear the testimony as I was back in the room in the back, and I did hear the discussions or descriptions of multiple locations.
Okay, so which one are you relying on? Because she gave two different accounts.
I'm not relying on either. I'm simply showing a demonstrative aid of some distances.
Okay, so if I told you, to plot some, I say plot points, I'm not in the field that you are, but if I said put it next to the couch, could you put the blue and green dots by the couch?
It could be done, absolutely.
Could you put them back by the back door?
They could be.
Could you put them you can put them anywhere in the apartment, right?
You could.
And all this is based on just moving those plots around. The reality is you have no way of telling this jury or this judge as to where the complainant was when he was shot, correct?
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all. The idea of, in some cases, when there's more physical evidence to work with, maybe a through-and-through gunshot wound, we have, in shooting incident reconstruction, the potential to try and position someone more accurately. But it's particularly problematic with bodies when trajectories go into them and there's no exit in particular. So I agree with you. I'm not going to tell the jury or try and indicate that I can say exactly where the decedent was when a shot was fired.
You also can't say where the defendant was when she shot the gun either, correct?
That's correct.
All right, so basically your testimony would be hypothetically a scenario that could exist and could be a possibility, correct?
I wouldn't disagree with that statement in combination with the fact that the 3D laser scan data actually allows for this for the first time, as opposed to, say, old 2D drawings and diagrams.
The 4-foot 3-inch marker that you talked about, the height on those blue and green dots, where did you get that number from?
That's also from taking an individual of similar size, getting an approximation of where the gunshot wound is reported, and having that individual then bend forward such that the trajectory becomes relatively horizontal towards the ground and measuring down. So it's an approximation.
Okay, did you meet with the medical examiner in this case on that?
Nope, I used the autopsy report.
And again, you said that's an approximation as well.
It is.
So we have a possibility as to where the gun was, a possibility as to where the decedent was, a possibility as to the trajectory of the gunshot wound as well, correct?
That's correct.
You also have an assumption about the height at which the gun was fired from as well, correct?
I do.
Because that could be a little higher, a little lower. You also didn't take into account the fact that she had inch-high boots on as well, correct?
That's correct. So that accounts for the assumption part.
And then you talked about your experience with, I'll call it double tap. What was your phrase for that?
The phrase I was taught was a standard defensive response.
Okay, so the standard defensive response, you basically said that trajectory analysis is based more on your personal experience and not any studies or anything you've done, correct?
No, I wouldn't say it's personal experience. The term is from personal experience in the classes I've taken, but the idea that the faster two shots are in sequence, the likelihood of them being more parallel than allowing more time to pass and more motion to potentially occur is simple logic.
Okay, so essentially what you're saying is the shots in succession like that would be more likely to follow a straight path, correct?
To be nominally parallel is how I might phrase it.
Briefly.
Yes.
Mr. Haag, Mr. Haag, could you just show me, you talked about the angle that you had the decedent at, correct? Can you either demonstrate the cord or show me what was that angle looking like to you? Because you had 4'3", right? So is that this, is that here? What are we looking at?
So how I did that as a measurement was, again, to have someone of similar stature, take a point that's close to the gunshot wound location, and then have them bend forward while I looked from the side until the torso was canted forward enough that it resembled the images that I'd seen, I believe, provided by even you guys of the dummy with trajectory rods and the description of the downward path in the autopsy report, and then simply measured from that location of the gunshot wound down. So not through the body and down, but from that down to the ground.
Okay, so what does that angle look like?
I did not actually measure an angle. I got a height measurement.
Okay. So you didn't actually even measure that angle, correct?
I don't believe we have an angle, and of course, trajectories in bodies are even more of an approximation than, say, a wall.
Okay, you be seated. I'll pass it to
Mr. Haag, that just you brought up a point there. The angle, the trajectory, well, the wound path in the decedent's body, is that also an approximation?
Absolutely.
And explain that.
Rarely do we have actual numerical values from autopsy reports. A lot of times there will be probes actually used with the body in order to visually show a trajectory, which we could measure from later. I don't believe that exists in this case. And in addition to that, compared to materials such as drywall or car bodies, where we have fixed points that we can put a probe through and actually measure, with bodies you can actually even get more, well, you can potentially have deflection through the tissue. So bullets travel nominally in straight lines through the air over short distances, very linear. But once they start hitting things, you can have some degree of deflection, and bodies certainly are in that category of where deflection can occur. So even if you take entrance to where a bullet was recovered in a body, having done tissue simulant and wound ballistic experiments, you can see slight curves sometimes. So entry to bullet location where it's collected has to be looked at as an approximation, just like some trajectories in objects.
And so again, it's part of the picture. You can take those approximations and look at possibilities and either rule them in or out.
That's correct.
And that's what we're doing with these Leica scans for demonstrative purposes. You're demonstrating possibilities that based on that can be ruled out by the evidence and that could assist the trier of fact in understanding trajectories and the passive bullets, correct?
Correct, and if nothing else, the relationship of those points, meaning, for example, the top of the posts in particular, relative to the other objects within the scene, the height in particular.
Nothing further.
Nothing further from us for this hearing, no.
Mr. Haag, where's the doctor? Yeah, Mr. Haag, you is there. Are there any objections to what Mr. Haag's intended testimony might be?
Yes, Your Honor. We would object to all of it, frankly. Mr. Haag testified, basically he's just plotting points and giving possibilities based on speculation and conjecture and assumptions. It does not assist the trier of fact at all. To begin with, the scan that he's using is the least reliable scan of the two. The first scan, the DPD one, which had less objects moved, is also not reliable because, as the court has seen, objects were moved around within the apartment. He testified he has no idea where Bo was when he was shot. He has no idea where the defendant was when she shot. He talks about this wound path being 4'3" and can't even give what the angle is. It's just all based on assumptions and speculation and possibilities, and that is not going to assist the trier, the jury in this case. And we would object his entire line of testimony.
Mr. Rogers.
Judge, to say that it's assumptions or to say that it's just rank speculation is very disingenuous. Mr. Haag is very well qualified. He's testified as an expert in numerous jurisdictions with regard to shooting incident reconstruction. And what he's doing is just taking, just like any expert, just like the medical examiner did. The medical examiner can't tell you that angle, the exact angle of the path. He can tell you an approximation, and then just like with the medical examiner, you can cross-examine him on possibilities. He can rule things in or rule things out. With regard to the data that he used, he's relying on data that's already been admitted into evidence that Ranger Adcock testified about, that how he did it and how the state sponsored that testimony, and they can't attack the actual data that was used. And all we're doing is we're using this for demonstrative purposes to show that these things can't be ruled out, that this is consistent with possibilities, and the state has the option, the opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Haag if they believe that that they can pierce his conclusions in a scientific manner.
Well, I will tell you that the court is troubled because Mr. Haag testified that, according to the information that he receives, that the shots were fired in rapid succession, and that simple logic alone would dictate that they might follow a similar trajectory. So the fact that simple logic alone could help us with the trajectory somewhat omits the need for an expert. But I'm also troubled because we don't know where, or rather, the information that Mr. Haag was provided, and I don't know all that he was provided. But at a minimum, I think he should have been provided with the body cam of the first officer on the scene, so that we could see that those persons made movements to the furniture. And I'm not an expert at overlaying this, but I was watching closely. It does appear that some of his data points are where the ironing board might have been. I don't know. I haven't tried to overlay these. And what he's testified was that he cannot tell us where the complainant might have been when he was shot. He cannot tell us where the defendant was when she shot. And he's made some approximations, 4.5, or rather 4.5 and 4.3. And I don't know that Mr. Haag was given good information. I don't doubt that Mr. Haag is qualified as a shooting reconstructionist, but I don't know that he was given the information to provide us with the evidence that this jury might need to make some complex issues simpler. But Ranger Adcock told us, based on something that's indisputable, the bullet that was in the south wall, what the trajectory was for at least that shot. And that's what I took from Ranger Adcock's testimony. So I don't know that we have reliable information about this other shot. And I don't know which was first or which was second. But I don't know that Mr. Haag was given adequate information, because he testified he can't tell us anything.
Well, Judge, he had the entire discovery, and you
Did
can't. Yes, Your Honor.
Did he have all of the body cams?
Yes, Your Honor.
So how is it some of his markers?
Well, Judge, I disagree that the 15-foot marker was where the ironing board ever was, or that they can prove that. The 15-foot marker is can show the jury an approximation of where the complainant could have been in a bending over position when he was shot. And that's all this is showing, is that is a possibility. Ms. Guyger testified that.
Well, here is a question that I just have. Did anyone take measurements from the threshold to the end of the bar? I'm calling it the bar, you all are calling it the counter. Do we know what that measurement means? Or Mr. Haag, do you even know? Oh, he's gone. So,
I can get him in
did
here.
somebody take measurements such that we could know?
From the straight on?
From the threshold, where I believe she testified she was standing on the threshold. Well, she didn't call it the threshold. I believe she said the silver thing. I presume that to be the threshold. Did no one took measurements?
There's a diagram,
Where is that? Is it in the evidence? I'm trying to make certain, because I believe that we use expert testimony to assist the jury with complex issues. And Mr. Haag testified that shots fired in rapid succession just bear upon simple logic as to what the trajectory might have been. And we know what the trajectory was from Trooper Adcock. Neither of you disputed his findings.
No, Your Honor.
So we know what the trajectory was for at least one of the shots, and as Mr. Haag testified, simple logic can tell us that the trajectory should have been about the same.
Right, Your Honor. I have the measurement from threshold to the.
Has it been placed in the evidence? Does somebody?
No, Your Honor, that's not been placed into evidence.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mr. Rogers. I didn't want to cut you off.
No, Judge, just my limitations for Mr. Haag was to show, based on spatial relationships, looking at doing his review of the evidence and what shooting reconstructionists do, is that a possibility for the bullet to be fired from a handgun that's 3 feet inside the apartment to 15 feet to a point between the counter and the couch, which is consistent with what Ms. Guyger testified to.
Is that your question for Mr. Haag?
Yes.
And which of your exhibits does he intend to use to explain that to the jury?
I can do that, Judge, with Appendix 86.
Can you put that back on the screen so we can?
I think that one, Judge.
Is that the one exhibit that you wish to use with Mr. Haag?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, he'll be allowed to use that exhibit to answer that question.
Your Honor, so just so we're clear, that is the lone question. Everything else has been sustained in terms of the objections. Is it possible to shoot from 3 foot in?
Is it consistent with barrel of gun being 3 feet inside the apartment to point 15 feet inside the apartment between the counter and the couch?
That's the one question you have for Mr. Haag.
Well, I also wanted him to discuss shooting one-handed and the recoil of how that occurs. That we can assume that the average layperson knows, and it hasn't been brought into evidence. And
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. I'm
No,
not trying to be difficult.
no, just that you fire a gun and the common reaction to firing one-handed, your first shot, the second shot, there's recoil and it would be on a parallel plane higher.
Your Honor.
And we need Mr. Haag to do that. Why?
Well, it's just not in the evidence. I mean, no one's testified to that. And when you look at, defendants 86, there's one, well, the shot is high. If you don't want me to ask that, I don't want to ask you, Judge, but it's not in the evidence.
No, I'm curious because we've had a number of persons that could have given us that explanation. I don't know that you necessarily need a shooting reconstructionist to tell us that.
Well, it's part of how he looks at scenes and how he determines.
But he told us simple logic would dictate that shots fired in rapid succession would follow the same or similar trajectory with
Right.
very slight variation.
Right.
That's what I wrote down.
Right. I just want to get that in the evidence.
But when he's telling us that simple logic dictates that an expert is not required.
Well, I don't know that it's been testimony to that, and he's
Not
capable.
not for lack of opportunity. We've had probably 30 officers in here, and the firearms and tool mark supervisor from Swifts.
And Your Honor, for clarification, this is the shot through the wall we're talking about here, correct?
Yes.
So the question is it possible from that angle for that shot to go through the wall?
Or for the shot to go at 4 foot 3 inches above the ground.
And Your Honor, again, I'd renew my objection there to that 4 3 inches is based on a bunch of assumptions he talked about. He didn't even ever have a person in that position. He couldn't give us the angle. The 4 foot 3 is, there's no scientific validity behind it. It's unreliable. So in terms of this shot right here going through the back wall, I understand that could be a possibility, but anything relating to 4 foot 3, that then gets into where the complainant was at the time of shooting, as well as his body positioning. I'm not saying he's not qualified in certain cases, but he doesn't have the requisite information in this case to be able to give that opinion.
He has the height of the complainant, and that's what shooting reconstructionists do. They take real heights of individuals that are involved, and he explained how he did it. He had a 6'1" person bend over at the approximate angle, because that's all the ME can testify is what the approximate angle was.
But I wish if he had given us a number or a degree,
But he can't give us a degree because we don't have a degree from the medical examiner.
I know, I don't know who could.
No one can give a degree in the wound. Well, but I'm not asking.
But maybe I'm slow, but I think there's only one trajectory that we can honestly say there is a factual basis to make.
Yes, Your Honor.
And that's the one in the wall. That both of you agree that Ranger Adcock gave us the best evidence as to what the trajectory of that shot was.
That is the only true angle that we have in this whole case. But the medical examiners testified about approximations, and this
Not
is...
approximations as to range of fire. And you are absolutely correct. That is the only true angle that we know about in this case.
And what the shooting reconstructionist can say is that the 4' 3" bar is consistent with the physical evidence. That's consistent with a 6'1" person.
We
bending
cannot
over.
say that because the furnishings were moved about.
So I'm not saying anything about the furnishings. I'm just saying that that point is 15 feet from the threshold inside the apartment, between the counter and the couch, and that's what 4' 3" looks like, which is consistent with the 6'1" person bending over.
Now, I did not do great in geometry, but I don't necessarily agree, because if the alleged complainant's wounds are on a downward path and that trajectory is upward, this is why I'm trying to wrestle with this even for myself, with this being confusing for the jury. Expert testimony should simplify things for a jury. And the one point that we do know about, there's an upward directional shot. And as I said, I don't know if Mr. Haag has been provided good information on which to make his opinions. You had the scans from DPD, you had the scans from DPS.
And he
Did
had
I write this down correctly, that he used DPS scans?
Yes, Your Honor.
And DPS was there a couple of days after DPD.
Right, and that data has been entered into evidence and been relied.
And the only thing Ranger Adcock said that he could tell us with some scientific certainty was where that shot, what the trajectory for that shot was. Am I recalling his testimony correctly?
Ranger Adcock also testified to his opinion based on his measurements that the feet, based on the feet of the complaining witness, that location was 13 to 15 feet inside from the threshold.
But not in reference to that shot. I do recall him saying that. I'm so confused.
And Your Honor, may I make one comment on that about the 13 to 15 feet? That the feet, that means absolutely nothing. We have no idea, and Mr. Haag said, we don't know where he was shot. He could have moved. The defendant could have moved him. There's a lot of different possibilities. So first we started with sandals, now we're talking about feet. That doesn't have anything to do with any definitive answer as to where he was shot. And the other thing I would just point out is even Mr. Haag said he didn't take into account the defendant's boots when doing this trajectory. So, you know, it may not seem like a lot, but an inch can matter in these sort of things. I mean, this is supposed to be science. And like you said, I'm not a geometry major or any of that geometry, but I mean, I'll tell you this, an inch, I would think, in something that's specialized like this, would matter. And he didn't account for that either.
We can raise it an inch.
I'm really struggling with this because he did testify definitively that he cannot say where the complainant was when he was shot. Do we all agree on that?
And no one can say that, Judge.
Okay. And he cannot say where the defendant was when she shot. He testified to that as well. Did he
Right.
not?
Right, Judge, he can just say what possibilities are. Basically, he can rule things in or out.
Because how is this helpful to the fact finders when you cannot provide us any direction, any certainty, any opinions about one of the
Well, Judge,
important facts to be found?
Mr. Hermes went through specific angles, and he said in his opening statement that the complainant was in a specific position. And so,
I don't think, well, that's not my recollection. I think he said, well, listen, this much I recall. Trooper Adcock gave us scientific evidence to rely on for the trajectory of a shot. Dr. Gwynn gave us his medical opinion as to the pathway through Mr. John's body of the bullet. Dr. Gwynn told us he could agree with some possibilities, but couldn't tell us.
right.
And Mr. Haag has told us today, I cannot say where the complainant was when the shot was fired. I cannot say where the defendant was when he was in fact shot. I can only tell you that shots fired in rapid succession, simple logic would dictate that they had a similar trajectory. And Ranger Adcock has demonstrated without objection what the trajectory of at least one of these bullets were. So I am at a loss as to how Mr. Haag's testimony will be helpful to the fact finder.
Just as helpful as the medical examiner, he can tell you possibilities that can be ruled in or ruled out, and that's what you.
And there's a difference here. Because as I said at the outset, Dr. Gwynn had Mr. John's body or person, opened it up, looked inside, found the path, documented, I believe from heart to lung. I'm not quite sure where the rib action was, to stomach, to intestines, twice, and then lodging somewhere near the spine, based on what he could see and observe. Mr. Haag has been provided information, but I don't know that it is reliable. And because you can't offer an opinion on any of the vital, important stuff, how is this helpful to the fact finders? Because even me, with my lack of geometry and or trigonometry, I don't understand either. Don't know what I heard from him has not been helpful when the principal issues is where was the victim when he was shot? Where was the defendant when she shot? We only know the trajectory of one shot, and none of you are disputing that, because that trajectory of the one certain shot that Ranger Adcock gave us is true within 5 degrees to either side, however far back we want to take it. It was how I took his testimony, all the way across the hall and into the next apartment. It will ring true forever. But he didn't attempt or try to give us where the other shot came from. And so I'm asking, how is this going to be helpful to the finder of fact? Because God help me, I want to get this right. But I don't, when you cannot tell us where anybody was when any shot was made, I don't know that your testimony is helpful. And help me, Mr. Rogers, if you can.
Judge, it is helpful for my defense, for Ms. Guyger, to be able to show the jury that this is a possibility that fits within the physical evidence and the trajectory of the one bullet. You can take that, and that's what the quick succession is so important, is because the two shots are logically going to be in a proximate, parallel relation to each other. And
That's my point. And we have that in evidence undisputed.
And we can show a spatial relation that fits with what Ms. Guyger has told this jury, and that this expert can say is a possibility. So that...
Well, I didn't hear that. What I heard was shots in rapid succession. Simple logic dictates that they follow the same trajectory. That's what I heard him say.
Well, he was talking about that in relation to everything about how you relate, you can relate one known shot to possibilities within that, that fit within that range. And the closer the shots are, the closer they are going to be an angle. That's why it would be, you know, less likely for one shot to be at a severe down and then all the way up here. So you're showing a point within the range where Ms. Guyger says the complainant was. You're showing a level at the 4'3" that's consistent with a 6'1" person bending over, and that it spatially relates to the known angle, the known trajectory of the bullet in the wall. And that's what that is, to show that her testimony was, there's a possibility that it is can be explained in relation to the known trajectory, and that's my purpose, Judge.
I'm sorry, Mr. Brown.
No, Judge, the state just renews its objections. I think the court has articulated very well why this evidence is neither reliable, based on the data that Mr. Haag used, nor is it relevant to assist the jury in deciding any fact, and the defense has failed to show either reliability or relevance by anything remotely approaching clear and convincing evidence.
State's objection to Mr. Haag's testimony. Let's bring in your next expert.
Judge, can I have a moment to huddle up and discuss the
Yes,
options?
and I'm sure you wish to make a bill of exceptions. Measurements on it?
There's a rough sketch, Judge, that was not put into evidence.
Okay. I'm just wondering.